Hey watercolor wizards, Hajra here. Today we'll be doing 3 ink drawings on Strathmore Mixed Media journal paper with a glass pen, spotter, and rigger brush, and Dr. Phil Martin's Bombay ink, so let the epic inking adventures begin. I did one of these ink pieces as a master's study of a Gibson girl, and then 2 original ink drawings influenced by that inking style. I started with a Gibson girl profile study. These lovely ladies are named for their illustrator Charles Dana Gibson, who was a remarkably talented artist with ink, though he also painted in other mediums as well. His beautiful Gibson girl visualized a fashionable ideal for the 2 decades at the turn of the century from late 19th to the early 20th century. Gibson said his Gibson girl was a composite of thousands of American girls that he saw, but he did use his wife and sister as a reference model often. As artists can relate, family members or your own self are the few free and readily available references out there. Charles Dana Gibson was himself also a handsome and fashionable man when he was young, and he was probably a reference for some of the men in his own drawings too. So I did my Gibson girl study with a glass pen and green Winsor & Newton calligraphy ink. It's a nice way of getting a steady, controlled, and even line, but because it's not a flat nib or a paintbrush, there is no variety of line, which would have added more interest and artistic appeal. I did try to just use ink and line density to show some value changes in the hair, as I didn't have varied line width to work with. For a small part of the piece, the brow and eye and lips, I did switch to a 20/0 spotter brush because I wanted to taper my lines a bit for these sensitive areas, and you can't really taper lines much with a glass pen, whereas it's natural for a brush stroke. I find that the glass pen is very comfy in my hand, and it holds a lot of ink in its little ridges, and as long as you wipe the pen on the side of the ink bottle before writing with it, no ink blots happen, which is more dependable than dip pen nibs when it comes to ink blobs. I can also press down on it like I would a mechanical pencil, and the tip hasn't broken yet, and I've used it 4 times or so, though I have read from some other people that their glass pen tip broke after pressing too hard. So try to avoid pushing too hard into the paper if you have a glass pen. I've also found that the glass pen works better for me as a lefty than calligraphy nibs or some dip nib pens, because I end up turning my paper upside down to do my calligraphic strokes in the right direction, and it makes me look really odd when I'm writing calligraphy. So this glass pen is nice because it's just a fine point, and it works the same for a left or a right-handed person. The ink I use, whether it's Winsor & Newton calligraphy ink or Dr. Phil Martin's Bombay ink, is permanent and waterproof, and it did tend to dry in the ridges of the upper part of my glass pen before I could use it all up. So the pen did need to be rinsed out in a jar of water every now and again before I got fresh ink. It does clean up and rinse off very easily, much more easily than a metal dip nib pen. A profile is one of the easiest angles of a person to draw, and since people are the hardest subjects to draw, if you are new to them, you can start with a profile to make sketching a person easier. Not only are we doing only half of the face, we're also doing flatter, simpler angles in the eye, nose, and mouth, and the one eye doesn't look at the viewer or have a second eye there that has to work in conjunction with it, so the success of the composition is much more likely. Gibson girl hair is piled atop the head, and though it shows a few highlights, it tends not to be overly shiny or structured, so it's rendered in a loose and very stylized way. This piece ended up being a lot of fun. I loved working with the unorthodox glass pen and also the elegant, genteel look and serene expression of this Gibson girl. And the green adds just a lovely touch of emerald to the whole piece. And now, moving on to an original ink drawing, but trying to keep some of the lively Gibson girl mood, I chose to draw an ink head based on Fay Wray, the petite and lovely actress from the original King Kong movie from 1933, which I think is still the best Kong movie of them all. Initially, I gave her shorter hair than she had in the movie, and instead chose to go with a 20s bob silhouette. I switched to a rigger brush by Silver Black Velvet and magenta ink for this drawing. I didn't know quite what I was going to do with her hair, but I wanted to be a bit different than the Gibson girl study. So I did some loose ink hair strand implication, and then I tilted the paper to make it drip a few times on each side. I eventually went back and added white ink in a few places to loosen the hair up further. It was a decision I made after filming, but you'll see the results in the video in the final image of this piece. So Fay Wray has these memorable sleepy eyes, and that small flapper era mouth and dark lipstick, which is so much fun to try and emulate in simple, quick ink. So there's no glass pen for this piece, and I did the rigger for the hair, but I did go back to the small spotter brush for the features for more control. Since this is an original, I already had some bleeds with the drips from the hair as a departure from the Gibson girl style, and I also decided to blend the ink out a bit to create some light shading for the mouth and around the eyes as a further departure from the Gibson girl style. I kept the clean slate of skin otherwise and a simple look to the hair structure, but this ended up being how I would do a Gibson girl, or a Meeks girl, rather, with some ink bleeding and some select ink glaze here and there to really emphasize the features. I also ended up with a few ink smudges here and there before I was smart enough to just put a piece of paper under my hand. Luckily, this paper is pretty white, so I just used a white gel pen to cover up those mistakes. And I ended up also using the gel pen to add some white highlights in the eyes. And it wrapped up into a fun ink piece with a more eclectic feel, and though the ink drips were an impulsive choice, I really like them. They really liven up the hair and the composition, and it ended up giving her a longer hair silhouette after all. Last, I did one more original ink piece, not based off of anyone famous, which is actually best because when you look at the piece, you don't project any preconceived emotion on it. This is an Indo-Aryan face, and I'm glad to make one of my original drawings a minority as well. I follow basically the same style I used for my previous ink original. The hair is loose and suggested, not realistically rendered, and I will use some light ink on the eye and mouth area to emphasize them further. And again, I used the rigger for the hair, the spotter and rigger brushes in combination for the features, and white gel pen to fix smudges and for some of the eye highlights. Because this composition was vertical and not horizontal like the previous one, I opted against any ink bleeds. Maybe I'll go in and add a hair ornament at some point, but for now, I added some flair with some loose pearl jewelry. The circles added some really cool interest. This is Strathmore Mixed Media Journal paper that I've trimmed out of the soft cover journal because it didn't lay as flat as I would have liked. It laid less flat, in fact, than Moleskine or Pentalic watercolor journals. The paper, however, is thicker than the Moleskine watercolor journal and more like the Pentalic journal paper that is similar in weight to Arch's watercolor paper. So it's basically a thick paper with a semi-cold press finish. Using colorful ink versus black or brown sepia ink was a way for me to make these ink pieces a bit more playful and interesting. There was no layered ink washes in any of these pieces. They were just simple ink drawings, so I wanted to be creative with the ink color. And the green, magenta, and turquoise really ended up feeling like the magical stuff of storybook spells and potion bottles, so it was really fun to work with them. I do my drawings freehand, whether for inking or watercolor painting, though a watercolor sketch is far fewer lines, while an ink sketch I do more work on. Someone recently asked about my sketching process, and I explained it in my Photoshop with paper layers video, so check that video out to learn how I layer, flip, move, and reuse vellum sketches. But to explain my drawing process, it goes like this. First, I do a spare sketch on vellum or other thin wax-free paper with just a few guiding lines for size and proportion. Then I transfer those very few lines to my watercolor paper, and if I want to polish and add to the pencil sketch, I go ahead and do that. For an ink piece, I'll develop it a whole lot and get a lot more pencil in there, getting the final pre-inking sketch polished, but for watercolor pieces, I hardly add any more pencil lines. I only fix the ones that are already there in that really spare sketch. Then I proceed to inking, or if it's a watercolor piece, I draw with a paint, just developing and shading and rendering with the paint rather than more with the pencil. I find this works the best for me. I don't want to have a detailed sketch that I have to transfer because I really hate how lines look when they are traced or transferred. I might have a beautiful, graceful sketch I did a lot of work on a separate piece of vellum, and then when I go to transfer it to watercolor paper, the sketch loses all of its grace and the lines are all angled and stiff and awkward looking, and I really hate that. And if I draw too much before I paint right on the watercolor paper, the lines get covered up or they get muddy after the first few washes, so all my fine sketching time is again wasted as I can't see any of the detailed lines anymore. So my solution is just to do most of the drawing with the paint in stages right on the watercolor paper and just have some minimal guiding pencil lines that I've transferred from a bare bones sketch. Anytime I do more than just those few lines, it's never worth it and it's always wasted effort for me. But by having that bare bones pencil sketch on a separate piece of vellum, I can save that sparse sketch and reuse it or flip it over or move it around before I draw the rest of it with paint on watercolor paper. Because most of my erasing has to do with positioning a subject, this saves me from erasing too many times on my watercolor paper, which doesn't like erasing because of the sizing in it. And so I just transfer a sparse sketch in pencil and do the rest of the drawing with paint on the watercolor paper. And that's it. Anyway, I was happy with how these quick ink drawings turned out. They didn't take much time to do, and I got to do a study as well as 2 original pieces in really lovely magical ink colors. Inks are great for quick journaling. And speaking of which, I am offering 2 free giveaways because you might know from my All About Art Journals video that I bought too many pretty journals and I'd like to send 2 out into the world to a good home. 2 brand new Handbook Journal Company drawing journals, available to any of my Watercolor Wizard subscribers who live in the US and who do an ink piece and share it with me via email to hajrameeks@gmail.com, Facebook message to Hajra Meeks, or Instagram post at Hajra Meeks. So for the 2 giveaways, one of these new journals is a 5.5 inch by 8.25 inch landscape format, and the other is a 5.5 inch by 5.5 inch square. They both have 128 pages of acid-free paper that is great for pen and ink, pencil, color pencil or marker, and lovely blue or green cloth covers, elastic strap closures, bookmark ribbons, and a useful clear envelope inside the back cover. Remember, I only have 2 giveaways this time around, and I will announce the lucky winners next week, and those 2 lucky US residents will receive a new free Handbook Journal Company drawing journal in the mail soon after. So get inking and sharing with me. Thanks for parking your brushes here. Please like, comment, subscribe, and check out my website links below. If you're interested in buying my originals or prints, please email me or visit my website for info. And until next time, wishing you all magical inking adventures.